Hi and welcome to this tutorial. In this tutorial, we'll look at how we can use the Spring framework along with the Hibernate framework. Hibernate is an ORM framework, and I've covered the concepts of Hibernate in a separate tutorial series. If you're interested in learning Hibernate, I'd encourage you to go and check that out. In this tutorial, we will look at how we can actually use Hibernate in a Spring application, and we'll also look at how we can use some of the concepts of Spring to make it easier to integrate Hibernate to our application. Spring and Hibernate are lightweight frameworks, and the way they've been architected, it's actually very easy to couple them both, and it's very common to see a combination of Spring and Hibernate in a lot of production applications. So here, this is something that we did in our previous tutorial. We had a JDBC DAO implementation, and it had a method that used the JDBC template in order to fetch the data from the database. So we used different methods of this JDBC template in order to fetch the data. Well, in Hibernate, there's something similar. We have a session object, and we use different methods of the session object to fetch the data. So this kind of ties in with the Spring concept of beans. Because if you think of how we would acquire a session object in Hibernate, that is through a separate factory object called as a session factory. And the session factory is a pretty expensive object. You wouldn't want to have multiple session factories getting instantiated all over in the code. You would want to have one session factory object for one connection to the database, and then create different session objects depending on when you need the interaction to happen. So the session factory is a singleton, so to speak, because there is only one object per application. And this ties in with the Spring Bean concept of a singleton. If you remember, we saw there were two basic types of Spring Beans. One was singleton, and the other one was prototype. You use a singleton bean when you would want to have only one instance of the bean throughout your application. And while it's not strictly the Java definition of singleton, in the context of Spring, it serves the purpose for having one object for the entire application. One of the simplest ways to integrate Hibernate with Spring is to have a bean for the session factory and make it as a singleton, and in your DAO classes, just get that bean, inject the bean dependency, and then get a session from the session factory. So it's as simple as that. So let's quickly implement that in this project. So again, this project uses a JDBC template. I have a DAO which has a method that uses the JDBC template. I'm going to create a new DAO IMPL, and I'm going to use Hibernate to do the same functionality to get the circle count, but I'm going to create this in a new DAO which uses Hibernate instead. Well, ideally I would have liked to use an interface over here, because right now, if I have to make a change, I need to change this to a Hibernate DAO IMPL or something else and get that bean injected. So what's the first step to integrate Hibernate into any application? You would need the libraries. I have a separate tutorial in the Hibernate series which talks about how to set up your application to use Hibernate, and I talk about how to download the jars and set up a library in Eclipse for those jars. I will assume here in this tutorial, in the interest of time, that you have gone through that video and you have a library for Hibernate set up in your Eclipse IDE. So once you've done that, all you need to do is right click on the project, go to properties, and go to the Java build path. And here in the libraries tab, you would need to add your user library. So I will say add library, user library, and I have the Hibernate library over here. So I just check that and click finish. And now we have the Hibernate library added to our class path with all the included jar files. Okay, so the next step would be to create a new DAO. Again, as I said, so this DAO uses JDBC. I'm going to create a new DAO which uses Hibernate. So I'm going to create a new Java class. I will call this Hibernate DAO IMPL and click finish. Okay, so in this Hibernate DAO IMPL, I intend to use just one method, which is the get circle count. So I'm going to copy the method from here. Of course, I'll be changing it to use Hibernate, but then this is the same signature. Okay, so in order to use Hibernate in this method, what I would need to do is to use a session object. I would need to have a session factory, and from the session factory, I'll need a session. And once I have the session object, I can use the create query method to make queries and then run them. So how would I get a session factory here in the first place? Well, I will declare a member variable private session factory, and then I will generate the getters and setters. Of course, I'll import session factory from org.hibernate and then generate the getters and setters. Okay, so now I have that here. Now what I need to do is I need to initialize the session factory and have that injected into this DAO. Again, you wouldn't want to create a new session factory for each and every DAO or each and every method in your DAO. You would need to have one common session factory throughout your application. So you would need to have a session factory singleton bean. So let's create a bean which initializes the session factory singleton. So I'll have a new bean tag over here. ID session factory class equals. Now what would the class be? One more way in which Spring helps us. Not only do we use Spring to create the bean as a singleton, we can also use a support class. Yes, just like we have the support classes for the data source and the JDBC, we also have support classes for Hibernate. Spring has provided us support classes when we're using Hibernate. So we can use that when we're using the Spring framework. So the support class here that I will use is this one. It's Arc Spring Framework ORM Hibernate 3 annotation, and the bean is annotation session factory bean. Now the Hibernate 3 in the package actually denotes the new support classes that Spring has introduced for Hibernate 3 versus the earlier support classes for Hibernate 2, which just had Hibernate in the name. So in order to get the new classes, the package name is Hibernate 3. So if you're using Hibernate 3, you would use this package name and this class. Okay, so now this is the class name and I have a bean. So this will tell Spring that it needs to instantiate a bean of this class and provide it as a singleton. But then in order to instantiate a session factory bean, you would need to know what the database is. And if we were using Hibernate without Spring, we would use a configuration file. We had a hibernate.cfg.xml, which had all the details about configuring how Hibernate behaves. Well, in this scenario, when we're using Hibernate with Spring, we don't need that configuration file. We can actually specify the configuration parameters for Hibernate in this bean definition itself. So I can have properties set for this bean, and I can provide the data source and a whole lot of other Hibernate properties over here itself. Now, why are we doing this? Why do we not need the configuration file? Well, the configuration file in Hibernate was there to make all these things configurable without having to change the source code. Well, you could have a new session factory and then provide all the configuration parameters in the code itself. But the whole reason why we had a configuration file was that you can change it in the XML itself without having to change the code. That feature is there in Spring anyway. Now, if you have a bean definition, you can anyway provide all the properties in an XML itself. So there's no need to create a different XML for the purpose. We can use those configuration parameters set in this XML file itself. So let's set the properties for the session factories. So the first property happens to be the data source. We need to provide the information about the database to the session factory so that Hibernate can go ahead and connect to that database. So I have a property name equals data source, and I refer to the existing data source bean over here. I already have it, so I will refer to this bean, and that's it. So now this Hibernate bean knows what the data source is, what the database is, and where to connect. So this data source bean has all the required information for Hibernate to connect to the database. Okay, so the next property that we can set is the packages to scan. We had this property called packages to scan to tell Hibernate what are the packages where Hibernate needs to check for the DTO or the model object. You know that Hibernate is an ORM framework, which means we need to have model objects, and we also need to provide information to Hibernate about how to map those model objects to tables in the database. So I plan to use annotated model objects, which is the annotations that we have covered in detail in the Hibernate tutorial. I plan to use a circle model object and annotate it with the required annotation so that Hibernate knows what the table and the columns are. And that is also the reason why I have used the annotation session factory bean over here, because I plan to use annotations in this project. You can look up the documentation to look at other session factory beans that Spring provides as support classes. Okay, so now that we have planned to use annotations in the model objects, we need to provide information to Hibernate about what package they are in. So I provide the property over here, property, and the property is packages to scan, and the value happens to be the package where I have the model, which is this one, org Kaushik javabrains.model. Okay, so this lets Hibernate check this package for annotated classes. Now we have a circle model class already. I will be annotating this one, but let's complete this configuration first. Okay, so now the other important information that we need to provide is the dialect. We have configured this as well in the Hibernate tutorial. We need to tell Hibernate what is the dialect or what is the language that it needs to use when talking to the database. We use the Derby dialect because we are using the Derby database in this tutorial. So I will set the Hibernate properties and I will set the dialect to a Derby dialect. And the way to do that is to set a separate property here called Hibernate properties. Now, Hibernate properties will contain the list of all the properties that you need to set in that you would normally have set in the cfg.xml file. So I have a props entry over here, and inside this props entry I can set the individual properties. So I have only one property in mind now. I will set the key as dialect, and I will use the org.hibernate dialect.derby dialect. Now, how do you know this class name? This is by checking the dialect package in the Hibernate jar. So we just go to the dialect package over here, and here you have the dialect classes for all the major databases that you would want to use. Okay, so now I have set this Hibernate properties. Note that this is a properties property. So this is a property of the class, and the type of this property happens to be a property. So this is all is required to get this bean up and running. Now Spring has enough information to initialize the session factory bean, but note that we have not yet annotated the model class. Now we have set the packages to scan to be this package, but then if Hibernate scans that package now, it will not find any annotated classes. So let's fix that. So this is my circle model object. So in order to mark it as a Hibernate entity, I need to use the @entity annotation. I will import the @entity from Java x.persistence, and then of course I'll also have to provide the ID annotation. So I will mark the ID property as the ID, again from Java x.persistence. So now this circle model class that we've been using so far, this becomes a Hibernate entity now. It's actually a Java persistence entity. So Hibernate is good to go now. It checks this package and it finds the model and it knows what the table and what the columns are. Of course, here it matches to what we have already said. The table that we have in our demo database is circle, and then the column names happen to be ID and name respectively. So we're all good here. We don't have to override any of these properties. Okay, so now we have a session factory. We need to inject the session factory into our DAO. Now we have a private member variable over here. We also have the getters and setters, but we need to tell Spring to create an instance of the session factory and inject it. I can do it very simply by using @AutoWired. This will work because session factory is of type annotation session factory bean, so it is the only type that's available. Spring has no problem in injecting it. So I will import AutoWired. So in our DAO, we have an initialized session factory ready to go. Now all that's left is to use the session factory in our DAO method, get a session and run a query. So let's do that next. So I will create a session. I'll open a session inside this method. And the way I do that is to get the session factory member variable first, which will get from over here, from the getter over here, and then I will do a dot open session. Now I have access to the session and I can fetch the the entity that I want. I will use a query over here just to keep things simple. I will write a string HQL here. It's not SQL, it's going to be the Hibernate query language. I'm going to use a select count of star from circle. Notice that here the circle happens to be the entity name, not the table name. Of course, in our example it matches, but then notice that we're using HQL here, which operates only on entity names. Now that I have a HQL query, all I need to do is create a query, which is the Hibernate query, equals the open session. You get a session factory, open a session, and then you create a query. Again, I would recommend you check the Hibernate tutorials, which covers all these concepts in detail. Now, for the create query, I pass in the HQL, which I already have over here. Now I have the query ready. I will have to import query from org.hibernate. Okay, so now that I have the query over here, I can use it to execute and return the results. So I will do a query dot unique result, and I can return this value. It's asking me to cast to integer because this returns a long. Obviously cannot cast, so what I will do here is I will change this to cast it to a long, and of course I can return a long, or I can get a int value over here. So let me do that. Int value. So essentially the unique result is returning a long, so you can have a method that returns a long, or in my case, since I already have an int here, I will just get the int value of that long and I'll return it. So now we have a DAO MPL with a complete method over here. Now I need to mark this as a Spring Bean, and the way I do that is by using a Spring Bean stereotype. I'll use the @repository, You can use any of the stereotypes, but since this is a DAO, it's actually a good practice to use the at repository stereotype. So this makes this a Spring Bean called Hibernate DAO. So let me get that over here. Hibernate DAO and classes Hibernate DAO. So import it, and then again this line will be the same. I'm just doing a DAO.getCircleCount. The getCircleCount this time happens to call the getCircleCount method of the Hibernate DAO instead. So let's run this. Of course, make sure your database is running, and then execute. So here you can see the Hibernate session factory has been created, and the output, the value of 5, has been printed. So this is the output of the getCircleCount method here, which is getting the same output as what we saw in the previous tutorial, but this time it's using Hibernate. So this completes a quick overview of how we can use Hibernate and Spring together. As you can see, the nature of Spring Beans goes hand in hand with the way you would initialize a Hibernate session factory, and it's very handy to have a session factory as a Spring Bean. Now that I have the session factory over here, I can actually use the session factory in all my DAOs. All I need to do is have an auto-wired session factory member variable in my DAO, and then in my DAO method class, in the method code, I do a get session factory to get access to the only session factory that we have, and that gets used throughout the different methods of the different DAOs in your application. All I do is I do a get open session to get a new session, and then I can perform all the typical Hibernate code, and I can use all the the standard Hibernate APIs using that session. So hope this was helpful.